So remember last class, yesterday, we talked about the anatomical position, we defined anatomy and physiology, and we were learning about directional terms and regional names. And so this was one of the topics that we covered, the anatomical position, and I listed the main criteria for it to be the anatomical position. And then I asked you, a body in the anatomical position faces the observer, true or false? So now you should see on your phone or on your web browser a picture of the slide and then the options to answer, A or B, true or false. The polling's open, responses are coming in, which is great. 87, 86, someone took their response away. There we go, let's back up. Okay, 94, 95, I'm answering 2. We'll let the clock run out, get everyone in here. Everyone's responded that's been able to log in, which is great. Now you'll see the answers come up overhead and on your device. Everyone answered A, true, which is correct, because you knew the answer from yesterday. And because you studied the anatomical position. Good. Next question. Small delay, but the question changes on your phone or your device. A body in the anatomical position rests with palms facing down. Now you should be able to change your answer as well. You add an answer, uncheck, you can change it back and forth. One of the settings is only accept the first answer, but I thought I'll let you guys huddle amongst yourselves, and if you misclick by accident, you should be able to change. But you can't change after the timer's done, which I didn't start it, but let's just cut it short because everyone put their answers in. Most of you, the large majority, got this answer correct. Palms should be facing up, not down, in the anatomical position. Good. So this works. Those of you that were able to log in, saw polling closed, any major problems so far? Questions came up, you could answer them? Good, okay. Okay. Alright, so we talked about the regions of the body. Fast forwarding, we had talked about directional terms. A brief review, directional terms are often in pairs. Meaning opposite things. So distal meaning further away from the connection point to the trunk. Proximal being closer to the trunk. Lateral being away from the midline. Medial being towards the midline. Superior being towards the head. And inferior being towards the feet. So we're going to try some of these new types of questions. You didn't close turning point, right? I want you to click a point on this image that's superior to the yellow circle. Polling's open. You should just be able to click on it somewhere. Anywhere on the body superior to the yellow circle. And we've got a clock going, but I can see 94 of you have answered. When we get to our target, I think there's probably 100 students right now. 98. Okay. So there's extra students. There's people trickling in still, which is good. We've got 101 responses. Well, let's let the timer run out. A superior place, a superior orientation or position above the yellow circle on the body is anywhere within those squares. Now, this isn't, I could be a stickler and say, yeah, the question says click a point on the body superior to the yellow circle. This is not on the body by any means, but neither is this, right? If you clicked within this square, you would have gotten that right. So these squares are running fast and loose. And this, I don't know who put that one in. I can go back and look, but you might want to review. Okay, good. On the body, superior to the yellow circle. Let's try the next one. Click a point on the body, distal to the yellow circle. Distal to the yellow circle. Distal. Superior and inferior. Common sense, you can sort that out. Distal to the yellow circle. Remember, the opposite was proximal. Not as obvious. You're going to see how much work it takes to put these questions together in a second. There you go. Nice job. Distal to the yellow circle. Further away from the point of attachment to the body. No matter what PowerPoint makes you think you can do with these rectangles, and you turn them on an angle and stretch it to cover the whole arm, as soon as you go to ask the question with turning point, it turns it back to normal. It makes it horizontal again. So every time I tried to make one rectangle cover the entire arm, I just got kicked out and it wouldn't work. So I have to slice all these individual things. But you guys all did a really good job of making sure that all the points landed on the body. Fantastic. I didn't even answer, so you did better than me. Last one, a point on the body, lateral to the yellow circle. Point on the body, lateral to the yellow circle. It's a fairly big circle, but there's lots of body. Find a point lateral to the yellow circle. Nice work. Anything to the sides of the yellow circle is considered lateral. This happens to be right on the midline, so anywhere to either side is correct, right or left, doesn't matter which side. If I had placed this over here on the shoulder, only towards the left on this arm would have been correct. Lateral from something that's off of the midline is only outwards, not back towards the midline. Okay, so those work, which is great. I'm going to take a little break from turning point, get onto some material, and then we have a couple more multiple choice questions later in 4 or 5 slides. So directional terms are invaluable in helping you navigate around the body, especially in describing your train of thought to someone else. Up, down, left, right, around, those things don't really mean a whole lot, but you can say distal to, proximal from, lateral of, and using or having that understanding and communicating that to someone that also has that understanding allows you to really navigate around the body with ease. Now, I've only introduced 3 pairs so far, and there are a number of other pairings as shown here. And one of them that's used a lot, that's fairly obvious, is anterior-posterior. We didn't get to see that on the other slide because it was in 2 dimensions and you couldn't see in front or behind. I couldn't point in front of the screen and behind the screen. But anterior means towards the front of the body, posterior towards the back. These are also sometimes called ventral and dorsal. We don't use those words as much. Anterior, posterior is more correct, but be aware there are some alternate names for a lot of these pairings. Another that we couldn't see on the last slide that comes in handy, describing levels in relation to the surface, are superficial and deep. So the skin is superficial to the rib cage. Well, I'm not. Maybe I'm going anterior, but what if I'm talking about on the mid-axillary line, on the side of the body? You'll figure out what that means shortly, mid-axillary. What if I mean over here? I'm not in front or behind. Superficial means more towards the surface. The heart is deep to the rib cage. It's more towards the center or the core of the body. So knowing these pairings will really help you understand how to navigate around and describe the locations of specific structures in the body. Now that's nice if you can see those structures or if you have a vivid imagination. We can also use planes and sections to get a window inside the body that allows us to drill down a bit more definitively with our directional pairings. So planes and sections are really useful ways that in a two-dimensional textbook, for instance, we can look at organs that are deep to the skin and then describe our way around those organs or those features. So plane and or section are an imaginary slice through the body. It divides the body generally in two, and then we look at the surface face on. And depending on where we divide the body, well, we obviously look at different internal structures, but we're using a slightly different plane. And the three main planes that you will use or invoke in this class are the sagittal plane, the frontal plane, and the transverse plane. So what are each of these? A sagittal plane breaks the body up into left and right. Left and right. So a sagittal plane cuts the body from top to bottom into left and right sides. If that plane happens to be right in the middle of the body, it's a very special plane called a mid-sagittal plane. Sagittal plane right on the midline, makes sense. And if it's not on the midline, it's called parasagittal. So I can still have a plane going through my left shoulder and through my left knee, separating my body into left and right halves. That would be a parasagittal plane because it's not on the midline. And in imagining that, I could then look at that surface and see the structures that make up the inside of my shoulder, for instance. It's a useful way to view those structures and not have to imagine. Frontal plane sections the body into front and back halves. There's no special name for a frontal plane in the middle of the body. It's just a frontal plane. Through the body, top to bottom, facing you horizontally. You imagine the front of my body falling forward, you would look at the rest of me through a frontal plane. You can see all the internal structures as you slice the front away and it fell forward. As gruesome as that sounds. And lastly, the transverse plane. We've got dividing the body into left and right. We've got dividing the body into front and back. The main other axis that's left, top and bottom. Transverse plane sections the body into top and bottom, which is why it's also known as a cross section. It cuts across the body, right through the middle, for instance. And I could look down at some intestines, up at the diaphragm, but the plane through the middle across my body would be a cross-sectional or a transverse plane. Anything else is called oblique. That's easy to remember. Anything on an angle, anything that's not on one axis, one of the well-defined axes, is called oblique. And you can see an oblique plane on this person's right calf at an angle through the lower leg on this example. Everything else is oblique. We're mainly concerned with those three main planes. And so using those planes, we can get a more invasive look or a more intimate sense of what's going on inside an organ. So the brain, for instance, we can section it along the mid-sagittal plane at the front. In a lot of the images where you'll see these planes used, there is an arrow showing the direction of the onlooker, where you're looking from. So mid-sagittal plane with your view coming from the right-hand side gives you this image towards the right. A frontal plane cutting the brain into front and back halves with the view looking backwards gives you this image. And then a transverse plane with the view from top down gives you the following image on the right. And it's important. You need, well, you don't need, but it's really nice to have that view arrow so that you can orient yourself in space. Because if I showed you this section, you can see the eyes, the brainstem, the cerebellum, a lot of other structures that we'll get into when we discuss cranial anatomy and the nervous system. Think about what type of plane this is, but also my question is, which way are you looking at this plane? Are you looking from the top or the bottom? It's impossible to tell, because we don't have any information on what happens behind the slide or in front of the slide. This is one two-dimensional slice in space, and there's no way to know if it's top or bottom. Incidentally, this is my brain. I was in a pretty traumatic bike accident in Toronto in 2015, and I was part of a concussion research study at Sunnybrook. And so I had a lot of MRIs taken, and they sent me this as a thank you. Like, thanks for participating in our study and being poked and prodded. Here are pictures of your brain. And I didn't really look at them a lot, and I'm hoping things like this don't really matter too much. I think that's a normal invagination in the brain. I'm looking for dark spots and depressions, but I think it's pretty normal, which is good. So I hope that you were thinking about what section this was, because that's the next question. What section, what plane am I showing you here? We don't know if you're looking up or down, but you should have a fairly good idea of what plane this is. So transverse, sagittal, frontal, oblique. Well, that's not supposed to happen. Let's repoll. Nobody saw that gaff, did they? This one doesn't have a timer. That's why it was a mistake. Transverse, sagittal, frontal, or oblique. Even if you did see it, it's possible whoever answered first is just wrong. So just make sure that you put down an answer that you're comfortable with and that you are sure about. All right, seems like near everyone has answered. This is a view of the skull or the brain. In what plane? The answer absolutely is transverse. Transverse or cross-sectional, up and down, top and bottom halves. What about this view of the brain? Here's a hint. It's not transverse. Or is it? No, it's not. What plane is this? Looking at this marvelous specimen of a brain. All right, everyone. Oh, there's more people coming in. That's great. 108 responses. Okay, I'm going to cut it off there. They're not for marks, it's for practice. Frontal, absolutely. Frontal plane, dividing the body into front and back halves. This is a section through my skull. This way the front half falls forward and you're looking at a face-on, a head-on section through the skull. Lastly, what is this plane through the skull? What I really like seeing is the number of responses keeps going up. That means more and more people are solving the turning point problem, which is great. And so there's going to be fewer and fewer emails that I have to field as the days go on. Also, I should say, Kathleen doesn't have anything to do with turning points. If you're asking her, she's just going to direct you to me, so send me your emails, okay? What view of the skull is this? Absolutely the sagittal plane. Maybe it's mid-sagittal. Hard to tell. There are some defining features that suggest mid-sagittal that we'll get to in that section. Not oblique, for reasons that we'll see in that section as well. But good. Excellent job. So questions and answers work well. Turning point works well. We see the summary of answers here, and everyone's getting the answers right. So you're paying attention. Good stuff. Let's move on. So we have names for structures, and we have names for regions. We can talk about things or surfaces. But some of those structures make spaces within the body. They encase other things in the body. And these cavities are generally really important areas where sensitive organs are housed. There are two main cavities in the body. Roughly, you can break them up into the dorsal cavity and the ventral cavity, or more correctly, the posterior cavity and the anterior cavity. Right? We know those words are interchangeable. The dorsal cavity is made up of the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. So the brain, all the cranial nerves, the spinal column sit in the dorsal cavity of the body. And it's one long, continuous, it changes in shape, but it's one long opening where the nerves of the body are distributed to their targets. Dorsal cavity, and then on the front, the ventral cavity, is the thorax, abdomen, and pelvis. This giant bubble in the middle of your chest. The anterior cavity is a place where we find a lot of really sensitive and important structures, and we spend almost the second half of the course in the anterior or the ventral cavity. Talking about the heart, talking about the lungs, talking about digestion, the liver, pancreas, etc. We spend a lot of our time in the second semester in this ventral cavity. But we don't like to settle for front and back only. We've developed as humans to want to categorize, make sense of things. So we break this down even further. We have the thorax, we have the abdomen, we have the pelvis, and then within these cavities there are different smaller subsections. And usually these subsections will house singular important organs or have a feature that's really important to notice, or they'll have a border or a muscle or bones that divide them naturally. The thoracic cavity, for instance, is divided into one main cavity in the middle where the heart sits. We call this the pericardial cavity. And then on either side, where the lungs sit, you'll find two pleural cavities. This one here is the right pleural cavity, and then on the other side, the left pleural cavity, obviously. This allows you a bit more specificity rather than just saying, look in the thorax or look in the thoracic cavity. You can say, okay, well, in the left pleural cavity within the thorax, you can find the left lung. The lung has two lobes. Look at the inferior lobe. And then on the anterior surface, look for this projection. So we subdivide them even further. And what's nice about these subdivisions, at least in the thorax, these are definite divisions. There are wrappings around these organs that separate the organs from one another. And you'll find these throughout all of the internal cavities. There are protective coverings around the inside of the cavities that extend onto the organs that protect those sensitive organs from impact, rubbing, friction, and wear. And these membranes are called serous membranes. These are generally very thin but very hard, very durable layers of tissue. If you've ever had ribs, for instance, I don't want to offend any vegetarians or vegans in the class. I don't eat a lot of meat myself these days, but if you've ever had ribs, on the underside there's sometimes a really hard layer of connective tissue or like a little flap that you can pull off. That's part of the serous membrane. I was in your shoes in my first year in anatomy. I went home and I was dissecting chicken legs, looking for ligaments, and then I realized this is gross, I know too much. So serous membrane, simply put, is there to protect the organs from the surrounding structures, from the bone. Now that the layer that you might find on ribs, if you ate ribs, is the parietal layer. That's the outside layer. The parietal layer is on the outside, lining the cavity, whereas the visceral layer is intimate, it's tightly wrapped around the viscera, or the organs. All the internal organs, collectively, we think of them as viscera. You heard of visceral fat? Visceral fat packs around the internal organs. Visceral layer of the serous membranes wraps around the internal organs. And so it's got two layers, and between those layers is this really slick lubricating fluid that allows them to slide over top of each other without creating a lot of friction or a lot of heat. And you can imagine these membranes being made in the following way. Imagine taking a balloon and then punching your fist into this balloon, and the balloon envelops your fist. One part of the balloon is touching your fist all the way around. That's the visceral layer in this example. And the other layer of the balloon, which would be within the cavity, is the parietal layer. And that air, that space between the two, moves freely back and forth and protects against friction. Serous membranes reduce friction. So these membranes are obvious in the thorax. There's one really big one in the abdomen. It's called the parietum, and it wraps around all the intestines. But the divisions in the abdomen are a lot less obvious. Oftentimes, you just draw an imaginary line through the middle and a line across, and you say the top right quadrant or the bottom left quadrant. In the thorax, it's very easy to distinguish. Anyways, more on that as we get to those sections. We have ways, though, to speak to surfaces or features. We can move around in relation to those features with directional terms. We can talk about where within the body to focus by addressing the cavities directly. All of these things have names, and we can discuss how to navigate around using those as anchor points. Now, I want to just briefly turn our attention to basic processes underpinning life before we end class today. We have another 10 minutes, and we should be able to get through this brief primer on homeostasis. Homeostasis is coming up, but first, to understand what homeostasis means, consider what it means to be alive, to be a living organism that's interacting with your environment. And it's a hotly debated topic. What does it mean to be alive? Life processes generally, and this is a slightly different list from what you have in the slides online, and I've highlighted where it's different. Or no, I haven't highlighted, but I'm doing it now. Organization is added to this list because the textbook that I gave you highlights that as a feature of life. And it's true. Life tends to be organized or make structure to become organized. Life tends to make compartments. We just saw examples of cavities and compartments. Life tends to make order out of disorder. Life tends to create spaces or create barriers. The skin is a great barrier protecting the rest of the body from external pathogens. We're creating order out of disorder. That's something that life does. How do we do that? It takes energy in order to make order out of disorder. Life invokes metabolism. Metabolism is all of the chemical processes that are going on in your body at once. All the things that are building new structures and all of the things that are breaking down old structures. And the names for those processes are anabolism and catabolism, which is really interesting. We take food, plants, animals, etc. from our environment, we ingest them, we destroy the structures that they've made, we say that's not good enough, we rip them down to their building blocks, and then we make structures that suit us. So we destroy whatever we ingest, take the building blocks, and make what suits us. There's an analogy in there somewhere. So organisms can do that. They can harness energy from their environment. Organisms are also responsive. If my environment changes, I can do something about it. If the lights go off right now, I could turn them back on. If it gets too hot in here, I could take a sweater off. I have the ability to adjust. If danger comes our way, if a tiger jumps out from stage left, I can run away. I can respond to my environment, largely through movement, right? Obvious movement is me walking back and forth or jumping out of the way to escape a tiger. But there's all sorts of movement going on in your body as you sit still. Your heart is moving. Blood is moving through your veins. Your lungs are moving. On an even smaller level, enzymes are combining with carbohydrates and fat and breaking them apart. That is also movement. Life moves. Life also grows in size and becomes more specialized, which is development, and then can reproduce, so it can make pretty good surrogate copies of your own DNA. These are all characteristics of life as a process. Now, for all of these things to work continuously, for them to be functioning optimally, we think of them as being in what's called homeostasis, a condition of balance, an ideal condition where normal function can be carried out. Whatever that normal function is. I can break down food, great. I can make new proteins, great. If I'm in homeostasis, those processes are carried out unabated. And we like to think of homeostasis as having a set point. I want my body temperature to be 37 degrees. But in reality, we have these goals. We never spend too much time at that ideal set point. We always vary away from, back towards, above, below our ideal set point. We create what's called an ideal range, or a homeostatic range. And you can see that shown here. We like to use temperature as our example, and this is an antiquated American figure that uses Fahrenheit instead of Celsius. But if we have this target temperature at the middle of our range, and this is 37 degrees Celsius, we allow ourselves to get slightly hotter and or slightly cooler as long as we stay within this range. We can work happily in homeostasis. This is describing the process of homeostasis. This is such an important concept that if we vary outside of this range, you can die. Depending on how far outside of that range you travel, you can be severely injured and or die. If your body becomes too hot, if you think about 37 degrees as ideal, too hot is 40 degrees. It's not very much of an increase. If your body temperature increases by 3 degrees, proteins start to unravel. Your brain starts to shut down. So we really don't want that to happen. Luckily, Our bodies have realized this is important, and so we have mechanisms in place to restore homeostasis. If I ever got too hot, I would start to sweat. Behaviorally, I'd take off my sweater, try to find a cold ice bath somewhere, I start to sweat. All these things to attempt to bring my core temperature back down. This happens always. It's happening right now. Blood pressure is another great example. We like to keep a normal blood pressure, whatever that is. We're not concerned right now. If it's ever not normal, let's say I called on you to ask or answer a question in the middle of class as a surprise, your blood pressure would jump. You get stressed. You don't want that to happen. I love, as soon as I said that, all the faces just looked down. You don't want that to happen. You can't maintain a high blood pressure for long, so your body corrects that high blood pressure. Slows your heart down, hopefully. Opens up the arteries to the skin. The point is, whatever the disturbance, or if we have a large disturbance, the correction is proportional to that disturbance. I know this is a lot of information on a slide that doesn't really move much or add new things, but this last point is kind of interesting. Since we're talking about blood pressure, have you ever thought, okay, well, if blood pressure goes up, the body tries to bring it back down. Why do people get hypertension? Right? If blood pressure goes up, your body should just bring it back down again. Why do people get hypertension? The reason for that is that if you always stress a system, you always develop hypertension. You have you're eating a lot of salty foods, or a lot of food, or drink a lot of water, any number of things. There's lifestyle factors that go into having high blood pressure. You don't exercise very much, you have a poor diet, you eat saturated fats, or you smoke, you are generally overweight or obese. All of these things are always telling your body, hey, I really want higher blood pressure. Your body gives up after a while. It moves the set point. So this isn't the best example because this is temperature, but the set point would go up and your body would start to regulate around that new point. You get hypertension because you've kept telling your body, hey, I think it's a good idea to have hypertension. Wow, it's not generally ideal. So maintaining homeostasis ensures that the body works properly. If we go outside of homeostasis, where the body wouldn't work properly, we rein it back in. And a lot of the ability to adjust and to correct is due to the unsung hero within the body. Not a structure, not a tissue, but the fluid that permeates the tissues in your body, that communicates or facilitates communication between areas of your body. Structures in the body are separate, compartmentalized. Fluid, as it travels throughout, can distribute food or hormones or heat. If you get too hot in one area as your blood flows, blood gets hot and it takes that heat away to another colder part of the body. All of these things are distributed via the fluids within the body. So, that's a general principle. Let me introduce one mechanism of control and then we'll call it for today. Homeostasis is important. It needs fluid and other things to help maintain homeostasis. If we go too far outside of our ideal range, we rein it back in. How? How do we control homeostasis? Whatever the disruptions are, and I've included some links here. These are in the slides that you have. There's some interactive animations from the old textbook. I won't tell if you don't tell, that you can use to understand these feedback loops a bit better. Whatever the imbalance is, the body turns on, ramps up mechanisms to correct it. And there are generally two branches of that correction. First one is first responders. It's a nervous response. The brain sends signals via the nerves and something happens almost instantly. The second is a delayed or chronic response. Hormones are released and make a more long-term change happen. Two main branches. So what does this look like? If I have this ability to rein in some disruption and return to normal, achieve homeostasis again, what does it look like? What I'm describing on this and the next slide, that admittedly I probably won't get to today, is a feedback loop. You might have heard of feedback loops before. There are positive and negative feedback loops, but regardless of what type we discuss, they all have four main attributes. Your slides say three, but I decided to add a fourth. The stimulus is an attribute. The thing that you're watching, the thing that you want to keep in a homeostatic range is an attribute. That's the subject of the feedback loop. I have the thing that I want to watch, blood pressure. How do I watch it? I have some receptor, something that monitors blood pressure. That's number two. Blood pressure is what I want to control. I have receptors that watch blood pressure. What do the receptors do with that information? They send that somewhere where it can be interpreted. Receptors are dumb. They just say it's this or it's that or it's changing. The controller interprets that signal. Oftentimes the controller is somewhere in the brain, and we still don't know. We have an idea of where in the brain things get controlled, but it's really hard to say it's this cell or it's in this area. It's usually just a black box. The controller takes the information, checks its records, and says this is higher than it should be. And if that's the case, it does something about it. What does it do? It activates an effector. There are a number of different effectors. Some get activated all at once. Maybe 5 things happen to correct the disturbance. But it activates effectors that are meant to return the disturbance to normal. And so we'll go through examples of this, of a negative feedback loop, and articulate what each of these numbers are when we get back to class on Tuesday next week. Have a great weekend.